Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, July 1944. While the world burned, the architects of the New World gathered in the cool mountain air. They were building a new golden age, a system of global stability, prosperity, and peace built on the ashes of 2 world wars. This system, they promised, would prevent the chaos of the 1930s from ever happening again. The official story, the one in the textbooks, is one of noble intentions. The British economist John Maynard Keynes argued for a new world currency, the Bancor, managed by a global central bank. But the Americans, led by Harry Dexter White, had a different plan. America was the last superpower standing. It held over 2/3 of the entire world's monetary gold, sitting safely in the vaults of Fort Knox. The American plan was simple. The American plan was absolute. The US dollar would be the new king of the world. The system was called the Bretton Woods Agreement. It was elegant in its design. The dollar would be the global reserve currency, the unit of account for all international trade. And the dollar itself would be, in their words, as good as gold. The United States government made a solemn promise to the world. Any nation at any time could redeem its US dollars for physical gold at a fixed price of $35 per ounce. For 25 years, this system worked. It financed the reconstruction of Europe and Japan. It fueled the golden age of the 1950s and 60s. It built the modern, interconnected world we now inhabit. But what if the entire system was a lie from the very beginning? What if the architects of Bretton Woods didn't build a stable house, but a golden cage, a trap designed to fail from the moment it was signed? What if the golden age was just the bait, and the 1971 collapse was not an accident, but the sound of the trap door slamming shut? To understand the 1971 heist, you must first understand the secret built into the 1944 system. It was a fatal flaw, a mathematical paradox. Robert Triffin, a Belgian economist, pointed out the system's core contradiction in 1960. For the world to have enough dollars to trade, America had to run a trade deficit. It had to send more dollars out into the world than it took back in. But here's the paradox. As the world's supply of dollars increased, the amount of gold in Fort Knox stayed the same. Every dollar printed and sent abroad was a new claim check on a finite supply of gold. Mathematically, inevitably, a day would come when the number of claim checks would be vastly larger than the gold in the vault. On that day, the system would become a house of cards. A global run on the bank would be inevitable. The architects of the system knew this. The central bankers of the 1960s knew this. By the mid-1960s, the fatal flaw was becoming a crisis. The United States was no longer the prudent banker of 1944. It was spending money it didn't have, on a scale that terrified the world. 2 great projects were bleeding the treasury dry. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society at home and the spiraling, bloody conflict in Vietnam. This wasn't just fiscal policy. It was a betrayal of the Bretton Woods Agreement. The Federal Reserve was printing billions of dollars, not to finance global trade, but to finance domestic welfare and foreign wars. These new, unbacked dollars were flooding the world, and the world was starting to notice. The first to act was France. President Charles de Gaulle was not just a politician. He was a student of history. He saw what was happening. He called out the exorbitant privilege of the United States, the ability to print paper money and exchange it for real goods, real factories, and real resources from other nations. He accused America of exporting its inflation. And in 1965, he did the unthinkable. He didn't just complain, he acted. He sent the French Navy across the Atlantic to New York. He presented his nation's US dollar reserves to the Federal Reserve and politely, but firmly, demanded his gold. De Gaulle was calling the bluff. This set off a panic. Other nations, Germany, Switzerland, the Netherlands, all began to quietly, then urgently redeem their dollars for gold. The drain on Fort Knox became a hemorrhage. The system was breaking. But the central bankers had one last trick, one last mechanism to maintain the illusion. In 1961, they had secretly formed what was called the London Gold Pool. This was a cartel of 8 central banks, led by the US Federal Reserve. Their one and only job was to rig the market. When the free market price of gold threatened to rise above the fixed price of $35 an ounce, which it did every single day, this cartel would dump tons of their own gold onto the market to force the price back down. It was a massive, coordinated global price-fixing scheme. It was a desperate attempt to defend the lie. For 7 years, this secret war raged. The cartel dumped thousands of tons of gold to fight the free market. But by 1968, the drain was too much. The run on gold had become a stampede. In March 1968, the London Gold Pool collapsed. The dam had broken. The central bankers, in a panic, created a 2-tier system. They would still pretend to trade gold with each other at $35, but they would let the free market price go wherever it wanted. This was the final admission of failure. The system was now a complete fiction. The link between the dollar and gold was a gentleman's agreement, and the gentlemen were now all pointing guns at each other. By the summer of 1971, the crisis reached its endgame. The U.S. had printed so much money that its gold reserves covered less than 22% of its foreign liabilities. In the first week of August 1971, Switzerland redeemed $50 million for gold. France followed, redeeming $191 million. The bank run was on. Britain, in a panic, sent a cable to the Treasury Department requesting to convert $3 billion into gold. It was the final nail in the coffin. $3 billion. America simply did not have the gold. The vaults were empty. The promise was broken. The golden age was over. The greatest default in human history was just days away. President Richard Nixon was cornered. Well, he wasn't a leader making a choice. He was the manager of a bankrupt corporation about to face his creditors. He called his closest advisors to a secret meeting. He told them to fly to a remote location where no one could find them. No press, no leaks. He sent them to Camp David. The official story, the one you've been told, is that Nixon was about to make a tough choice to protect the dollar from speculators. The truth is, the choice had already been made. The heist was already planned. They weren't meeting to debate a solution. They were meeting to plan the announcement of the crime. Camp David, Friday, August 13th, 1971. For 3 days, 15 of the most powerful men in the world were cut off from the public. They were led by President Nixon, but the intellectual architect of the plan was Treasury Secretary John Connally, a shrewd, ruthless political operator from Texas. He was joined by a young, ambitious budget official named Paul Volcker, a name that would echo through financial history. The official story paints this as a weekend of agonizing deliberation, a deep philosophical debate about the future of the global economy. This is a complete fabrication. The decision was already made. The mood was not one of debate. It was one of damage control. They were not economists. They were conspirators. They were plotting how to announce a global sovereign default in a way that made them look strong, not bankrupt. John Connally, in his own words, was blunt. He told Nixon, "We've got to break the link. We've got to stop the bleeding. We've got to default. But we can't call it a default." The plan was to blame foreign speculators, to frame this default as a patriotic act of defiance, a defense of the American worker against shadowy foreign forces. They drafted the speech. They planned the market closures. They timed it for a Sunday night when the world's markets were closed to cause maximum confusion and prevent an immediate coordinated response. On Sunday, August 15th, 1971, Richard Nixon sat in the Oval Office and looked directly into the television camera. He spoke to the nation and to the world. He announced he was temporarily suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold. This single word, temporary, was the greatest lie of the 20th century. It was not temporary. It was permanent. It was the Nixon Shock. In that moment, Nixon severed the last, final thread connecting money to value. He had just, with a single speech, turned the entire global financial system into a fiat experiment. Every dollar in every bank, every savings account, every pension fund was no longer a claim check on a real asset. It was now officially just a piece of paper, backed by nothing but a promise from the same government that had just broken its most solemn promise. The heist was complete. The world's central banks, holding billions upon billions of US dollars, woke up on Monday morning to a terrifying realization. Their gold reserves were gone. They had been replaced overnight with stacks of paper IOUs from a defaulted creditor. They were trapped. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Global markets gyrated wildly. Currencies, unanchored from gold, began to float aimlessly against each other. The era of stability was dead. The 1970s lost decade had begun. The official story, again, is that the 1970s stagflation, that crippling combination of a high inflation and high unemployment, was caused by the 1973 oil shock. This is another, more insidious lie. The timeline, however, suggests a different narrative. The inflation began the moment Nixon closed the gold window. If you look at the charts from 1971 to 1973, before the oil embargo, prices for all global commodities were already exploding. Why? Because the world's producers were not blind. They were being paid for their real goods with a US dollar that was rapidly losing its value. The dollar was in free fall. To protect themselves, they had no choice but to raise their prices. This suggests the OPEC nations didn't initiate the crisis. They were reacting to it. They were trying to price their real assets against a currency that was being devalued by its own government. This was the collapse that the 1971 decision unleashed. A world of soaring prices, a world of economic uncertainty, a world where the US dollar, the king of the world, was now a dying currency. The US empire should have faced a day of reckoning, but it didn't. Why? Because the 1971 default wasn't the end of the story. It was just phase one. The architects of the new order understood that if the dollar was no longer backed by gold, it needed a new foundation, a foundation built on something the world had to buy, something every industrial nation needed to simply exist. That foundation was oil. In 1973, as the world reeled from the oil shock, Henry Kissinger embarked on a series of high-stakes shuttle diplomacy missions. The public story was peace, but the financial story was the creation of a new mechanism. He flew to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, for a series of critical negotiations with the Saudi royal family. Was this just a coincidence, or was it the architecture of a new empire? What emerged from these meetings was a powerful, unspoken arrangement. The United States would offer its full military and political backing to the House of Saud, guaranteeing its security in a volatile region. In return, Saudi Arabia, as the dominant force in OPEC, would use its power to ensure that global oil sales would be conducted almost exclusively in US dollars. It didn't matter if Japan wanted to buy oil. It didn't matter if Germany wanted to buy oil. They could not pay in yen. They could not pay in Deutschmarks. They, and every other nation on earth, would be forced to acquire US dollars first, just to buy the energy they needed to survive. With this move, the fiat dollar was rebacked. The dollar was no longer backed by gold. It was now backed by oil. This new system was, in many ways, more powerful than the gold standard. A nation could, in theory, live without gold. It could not live without energy. This created a permanent artificial global demand for US dollars, and it gave the United States the true exorbitant privilege. The US could print paper money and trade it for real oil, but the plan was even more insidious than that. It wasn't just about forcing the world to buy dollars. It was about controlling what happened to those dollars next. This was called Petrodollar Recycling. Think about it. Saudi Arabia and the OPEC nations were now flooded with billions of US dollars. Petrodollars. They had far more money than they could possibly spend on their domestic economies. What would they do with this ocean of paper? The American architects had an answer for that too. The deal was that these petrodollars would be recycled back into the United States. The OPEC nations would use their oil profits to buy US assets. Specifically, they would buy US Treasury bonds. This is the mechanism. This is the core of the new empire. Let's follow the money, step by step. Step 1. The US government needs money for its military, its social programs, its interest payments. It prints bonds, IOUs. Step 2. The US Federal Reserve prints paper dollars. Step 3. The world must buy these paper dollars from the US to buy oil. Step 4. The dollars are sent to OPEC nations in exchange for real oil. Step 5. The OPEC nations, now holding billions of petrodollars, send them right back to America and buy the US Treasury bonds. It is the perfect closed loop of power. The United States prints money to buy oil, and that same money is then loaned back to the US government to finance its own debt. This is the system that has been in place for 50 years. It is the system that allows America to run trillion-dollar deficits every single year, with no apparent consequences. It is a global tribute system. The US exports its inflation, its paper dollars, to the rest of the world, and in return, it receives real goods and cheap financing for its own government. The collapse that should have happened in 1971 was unleashed, but it was unleashed on everyone else. The United States had successfully shielded itself, turning its greatest weakness, a fiat currency, into its most powerful weapon. This petrodollar system was the new global order, and it was enforced not by the trust of a gold standard, but by the cold, hard steel of the US military. Any nation that challenged this system, any nation that tried to sell its oil in a different currency, would find itself on the receiving end of that weapon. In 2000, Saddam Hussein of Iraq announced he would begin selling his oil in euros. We all know what happened to Saddam. In 2011, Muammar Gaddafi of Libya announced a plan to create a new Pan-African currency, a gold dinar, to sell his oil. We all know what happened to Gaddafi. For 50 years, this mechanism has been the unquestioned, untouchable architecture of American power. It was the perfect empire. It was built to last forever. But empires, especially empires built on debt and enforced by threats, always have a lifespan. And what we are witnessing right now is the beginning of the end. The 1971 heist is finally unraveling. The victims of the system are beginning to fight back, and the collapse that was unleashed half a century ago is finally coming home. The 50-year empire of the petrodollar was built on a simple, brutal equation: oil equals dollars, and dollars equal U.S. government debt. This system gave America unimaginable power: the power to print, the power to spend, and the power to punish. The U.S. dollar wasn't just a currency, it was a weapon. Through the SWIFT system, the U.S. controlled the digital plumbing of global finance. It could, with a keystroke, cut entire nations off from the world economy, and in 2022, it finally overplayed its hand. When Russia was sanctioned, the United States and its allies did something unprecedented. They didn't just sanction individuals, they seized the foreign currency reserves of Russia's central bank. This was a shockwave. It was a message to every other nation on Earth. It was the moment the world woke up. It was the moment that China, India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, and every other nation realized a terrifying truth. Their U.S. dollar reserves, their U.S. Treasury bonds, were not assets. They were liabilities. They were claim checks that could be revoked at any time for any political reason. The full faith and credit of the U.S. government was revealed to be a tool of coercion. The 1971 heist had come full circle. In 1971, the world learned their dollars were not redeemable for gold. In 2022, they learned their dollars were not even redeemable for dollars. The run on the bank has begun again, but this time it's not a run on gold. It's a run away from the dollar. This is the great unraveling. We are living through the death of the petrodollar system. The pattern is repeating, but in reverse. Pattern element 1, the de-dollarization alliance. The nations branded as America's rivals, Russia and China, are now in a financial alliance, but they have been joined by the linchpin of the whole system, Saudi Arabia. The BRICS alliance, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now, crucially, the energy powerhouses of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Iran, is not just a political club. It is an economic lifeboat. It is a coalition of nations actively building a new financial system. Pattern element 2, the petrodollar deal is broken. For the first time since 1973, the equation is broken. China is buying Russian oil in yuan and rubles. India is buying Russian oil in rupees. China is now in talks with Saudi Arabia to buy oil in yuan. This is not a headline. This is an earthquake. The one rule that propped up the dollar for 50 years has been broken. The backing for the dollar is finished. Pattern element 3, the return to gold. What did Charles de Gaulle do in 1965 when he saw the system was a lie? He bought gold. What are the world's central banks doing right now? In 2022 and 2023, central banks bought record amounts of physical gold, more than in any year since the 1960s. China, Russia, India, Turkey, they are all quietly, desperately dumping their US dollar reserves and replacing them with the one asset that cannot be printed, cannot be sanctioned, and cannot be defaulted on. They are preparing for the end of the fiat experiment that Nixon began in 1971. Pattern element 4, the new mechanism. The BRICS nations know they cannot operate in a new economy using the enemy's plumbing. They are building their own SWIFT. It's called Project M-Bridge. It is a new digital pipeline that allows central banks to settle trades directly with each other, using their own currencies, completely bypassing the US dollar. This is the weapon that will end the petrodollar. The collapse that Nixon unleashed in 1971 was not a single event. It was the start of a process. It was the start of the 50-year inflation that has slowly, silently eaten away the savings of the middle class. The US dollar has lost over 98% of its purchasing power since the Federal Reserve was created, and a staggering 87% of it since Nixon's 1971 heist. That is the collapse. You have been living in it your entire life. We are now in the end game of that collapse. The trillion-dollar deficits are no longer sustainable. The world no longer wants to finance the US debt. The US government is now trapped. With no foreign buyers for its bonds, there is only one buyer left, the Federal Reserve itself. This is called debt monetization. It is the exact same playbook that Rudolf Havenstein used in 1922 Weimar Germany. The central bank is printing money to buy its own government's debt. It is the final desperate act of a dying currency. It is the mathematical certainty of hyperinflation. The architects of the New World Order, the central bankers at the Bank for International Settlements, they know this. They are planning for this. They know this coming collapse will be blamed on speculators or wars or climate change, but it is an engineered demolition. Just as the chaos of 1944 allowed them to build the golden cage of Bretton Woods, just as the chaos of 1971 allowed them to build the petrodollar cage, the coming chaos of this collapse will be used to offer a solution. A new system, a great reset. They will promise stability. They will promise safety. They will promise an end to the inflation they created. And this new solution is already built. It is the central bank digital currency, a CBDC. If Bretton Woods was a golden cage and the petrodollar was a military cage, the CBDC is the final digital cage. A cage where money is programmable. A cage where every transaction is tracked. A cage where your savings can be frozen, restricted, or deleted by the same authorities who unleashed the collapse in the first place. The 1971 heist wasn't just about gold. It was about control. It was the removal of the final barrier, the final restraint on state power. It was the moment the central bankers proved they could, and would, change the rules of the entire world overnight, with no accountability, and that the collapse was not a bug in the system. It is the system.